Welcome to the PetroPapers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yogesh Pradhan, and with me here today, I have Chad Centers and Rachel Harper. Both are from ProTechnics, and both are regional engineering advisors. Today, we're going to talk about SPE 209124. Paper title and the description is in the description box below for our viewers and listeners on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. I'm going to give an introduction for Chad and Rachel before we start peppering them with questions. Chad Centers is the U.S. sales manager for the ProTechnics division of Core Laboratories. He has over 15 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, including stimulation, coiled tubing, and downhole tools, in addition to completion diagnostics. He's a graduate of the Missouri University Science and Technology with the BS in Chemical Engineering and a graduate certificate in Management and Leadership. Centers is an active member of SPE and has held a variety of section officer positions, including section chair, and is currently serving as a program chair. He's also a member of the SPEI Distinguished Lecture Committee or Tech Workshop Committee, as well as the Oklahoma City Oil and Gas Symposium. He's a past recipient of the SPE Regional Production and Operations Technology Award and the Outstanding Young Member Service Award for the Mid-Con region. He has published and presented numerous papers at SPE, HFTC, and ATCE, and is an active contributor in several SPE Applied Technology workshops. He's committed to passing on industry knowledge and experience to students and young professionals through local and international SPE mentorship programs in which he actively participates. Now I'll talk a little bit about Rachel. Rachel Harper is a regional engineering advisor at ProTechnics. She has 5 years of experience in the oil and gas industry with a background in stimulation with Schlumberger and completions diagnostics. She's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, Hookham, with a BS in petroleum engineering. She's a published author of 2 SPE papers. Rachel is an active member in SPE and serves on the Permian Basin Completions and Operations Study Group Committee. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Well, to reorient our viewers and listeners for this paper, could you walk us through what the paper is about?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a follow-up to the ATCE paper we did, and it was presented in Dubai. And that paper introduced the industry to a variety of metrics that are utilized along with the tracing diagnostics to capture the results from a project in various forms. For instance, we had known lateral contribution that looked at a flow assurance for a well and determined how well specific wells are flowing over time. We had heel to toe ratio, proppant coverage, and communication intensity was introduced at that point in time. And we had some case studies for each of these metrics along with that introduction. This paper for the HFTC called Look Who's Talking, and that's a paper focused on the communication intensity metric exclusively, in which we were able to dive in deep with the case studies, including a high-level overview of the metric itself with geology and the effects of communication around some geologic features in an area and how that compares from project to project, different types of frac sand and what does that do to your communication intensity, as well as infill well development and depletion. So depletion is kind of an obvious one, right? If you've got a depleted area, of course you expect to see higher communication, but the main thing about the communication intensity, for the first time, you can have a benchmark to compare that communication on the depleted pad to a well that, or a pad that has a tighter group of wells or possibly less wells per section, and you can dial in your various preventative techniques and mitigation techniques around that depletion in relation to communication intensity.
Awesome. I was also wondering, since you've mentioned communication intensity quite a bit in the paper, could you clarify for viewers and listeners what exactly communication intensity is?
So communication intensity is a diagnostic metric that measures your magnitude of communication between your wells in a project or your interwell communication. It can be looked at on a project level or a well level. For well level, it's generally measured as outgoing communication. So it's communication from one well to the offset wells. And then on project level, it's like high level view of all of the communication going on within a pad. And it's calculated based on looking at the recoveries of the tracers in the offset wells and comparing that to the tracer recovery in the trace wells. And in addition to that, we also take into account the duration. So like we take a time weighted average, and generally we like to focus on 0 to 30 days, 31 to 60 days, 61 to 90 days, so on and so forth. But having that duration component, you can see the magnitude of your communication and then how it's changing over time.
Awesome. When I was reading the paper, I told my team, for example, how interesting the communication intensity metric is when quantifying, when trying to get a better understanding of how to make sense of the tracer work, and especially with fracture-driven interactions. So having that communication intensity was really helpful for us, and especially helping us get to the answer with figuring out fracture-driven interactions. And I really am very appreciative of this metric. So I want to commend both of you on that.
Thanks.
I wanted to go deep into the paper, and Chad already mentioned this when we were walking through the paper, but why different types of proppant may not have had a correlation with communication intensity. I was wondering if you can explain that.
So we're going to kind of, so we expected the white proppant, because it's, API spec or white, to, create a more conductive pathways. Thus, they would last longer as the wells communicated. But what was interesting was that white and regional proppant seem to have similar communication intensities in this area, in this case. And then for 0 to 30 days, and then from 31 to 60 days, they both drastically dropped off. So it looked like there was something else causing the communication to decline, and that proppant wasn't a driving force. That's at least my conclusions of it.
Yeah, and just to add on that a little bit, Rachel, the communication dissipated at 60 days for each of those tracers, so they fell below the detection limit during that time. So the sustained communication beyond that time would probably have been different for the proppant types if it had a connected pathway between the wells that was measured at a point in time that was greater than 60 days, because the proppant conductivity due to the regional sand, if it was less, it should have fell off more if that communication was sustained beyond that time.
Thanks for that explanation. I wanted to pivot to another thing you mentioned, which is what the majority of the paper is about, especially with infill development. Could you talk more about that correlation between infill development and communication intensity?
Yeah, absolutely. So the infill well development, as I mentioned earlier, you would expect to see more communication on an infill well development versus a fresh set of wells that were recently drilled and completed all at the same time due to the effects on depletion. So in this paper, we looked at two different case studies around the infill well development and depletion specific to an area. And one of the case studies was really neat because we had, basically 2-mile laterals that were extended out, and there were all fresh, newly drilled wells, and a 1-mile lateral that overlapped with a section of the wells that were recently drilled and completed that was previously produced. So it was a primary or parent well to the project. And in that area, the previous production from that primary well, we actually saw more communication to the offset wells around it in that depleted area compared to the area that was not produced in the toe sections of the well. And it's not unique to the study in the paper. We often see this around areas that were developed with heavy vertical wells. And if you've got concentration of production around there, you may see localized communication events due to that depletion. One of the things we're able to do here is capture that metric and compare it to other projects within the area and see how much of this localized depletion around that overlap is driving the communication for the project.
That's really awesome. I know it's really dependent on the number of wells on the pad to really determine that infill development and communication intensity. I was really interested in this question because when even thinking about frac mitigation strategies, for example, we're trying to find a way to quantify that communication between primary and infill wells and how you track that. And using this technology or using this metric is pretty useful. And it adds that quantification to tracer work. So I wanted to reinforce that. Well, the question that I had was in designing it. So this is something that we've been doing as a team actually internally, and I'm sure other people have been thinking about this too. So I'm asking for operators in working with you, what are some of the best practices to design a test to look at infill development and communication intensity?
Well, one thing I definitely think you should focus on is keeping as many variables the same as possible. So like make sure you're in the same area, rock or formations. And then you want to make sure you have a similar or consistent diagnostic design. So like it's best to capture as much of the lateral as you can, but if you can't do that, then try to trace the wells similarly as you're comparing the communication. That way you're like looking at a one-to-one situation. And then additionally, you want to consistently sample the wells. So you have to involve the production team and make sure that you're pulling samples like on the same day from the offsets in the trace well or as close as possible to get a good snapshot of what your communication is looking at a point in time. Those would be my main things that I try to focus on and get clients on the same page. I really think it's important to incorporate all teams. If you get geology and everyone into a team, you find that you can get more out of a diagnostic project rather than one area.
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. That's all really awesome stuff. I think from our experience, we've seen a variety of different diagnostic designs and things that we're testing. And I think I call it the science well dilemma, where you've got some diagnostic dollars that you can spend and you would want to go out and just test everything you possibly can at the same time. And that's great in some applications, but for communication intensity, you really want to try to keep that consistent across the project. So as far as looking at your stimulation design volumes and different types of chemicals you're using, and if you're going to try a mitigation or preventative technique within the project, you should capture that and set it up in a way where you can test it on certain sections of the lateral near each other, if possible, by alternating to where you're not to where you're trying to normalize the geological effects as well as the effects of the mitigation technique by itself. And so, and you might say, well, what's the mitigation technique? Well, there's some cases we've seen, far field diverter, different proppant types, and there's some other products out there that are hitting the ground here. And people are trying to really solve this complex problem, and we're involved in a lot of that work. It's very, very, very exciting to be on the cutting edge of that, to use communication intensity to benchmark the results of that of those studies with the diagnostics and comparison of project to project or well to well with the different techniques.
Rachel, I really enjoyed the fact that you said adding different departments to make sure that you can get the most out of a diagnostic, because I know that I've worked on projects in the past where when you add more team members, you get you get the brain trust really to make sure you're getting the most out of a project. So I really appreciate that. And Chad, I really appreciate you mentioning how, especially for frac mitigation techniques, making sure that you're normalizing for geology from heel to your toe. That way you don't have any heel or toe bias whenever you're experiencing any asymmetrical fractures between primary and infill wells. So, well, I've peppered you all with a few questions regarding communication intensity and this latest HFTC paper. There's one question I don't want to leave you without, and it's, other than the communication intensity metric, and since my primary work that I've done with you all has been tracer work, what are some of the latest technologies and techniques that ProTechnics is investing in?
Well, one of the things that I'm most excited about right now is we're incorporating Decode, which is it's Core Labs technology, and it's a physics-derived model that takes your drilling data and incorporates their database of logs that they have. And you can get geomechanical properties of your rock along the lateral. So for instance, we can get pore pressure and relative brittleness. And this just gives you some insight of either like rock before you trace a well so that you can trace similar rock and do your A/B testing, or you could look at how your well is producing and communicating and then evaluate maybe why, or get some insight from the rock of why it's communicating so strongly. Maybe it has a lower pore pressure and it's a depleted zone, or there's a ton of natural fractures that we're noticing in the decode. And so it's cool to get an idea of rock was always the missing piece with tracers, and now we have some insight that I'm excited about.
Awesome. Chad, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I always want to talk. No, that's really great, Rachel. And I think it's important to note that from what we've seen, there's not a lot of information available in a new horizontal well for geology, right? So to have something that we can use that's from readily available information versus an uncommon horizontal log is really neat. In addition to the GoTrace technology we talked about earlier, where you can deploy the tracers using perforating guns and target those different clusters and get cluster level contribution and flow assurance on different refract techniques. Another thing is the cement tracing, actually. So I call it back to the basics campaign right now, and a lot of people are really evaluating their cement tracing, and it's not necessarily a new technology that we're investigating in, but it's an exciting technology of repurposing some of, not really repurposing because it's been done a lot in the past, but kind of taking a look at our cementing practices as we've come out of the downturn and how that affects everything by using low density proppant tracers and going in with a spectral gamma ray before the frac and kind of determine where your cement is placed and how well your coverage is across the lateral with that cement, and then to evaluate with the other two proppant tracers how contained the frac was on a cluster and stage level with that cement isolation. So it's really exciting. Seen a lot of people doing that, doing some cool things around, maybe running centralizers or using a rotating technique with some premium casing connections to try to improve their cement quality, and that's really driving a lot of success in some areas. So that's some of the things that we're really excited about, that we're investigating in and trying to help the industry out here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it was a pleasure to have both of you on the podcast. Thank you for letting me pepper you with questions.
Anytime.
Well, you heard straight from Rachel and Chad regarding SPE 209124 and the information that's all about in there. Please be sure to send me any feedback through my email or through any of my social media handles, which I will have in the description box as well. I'm Yogashri Pradhan, and I'm signing off.